When we picture an empire, our minds immediately go to conquering armies, sprawling borders, and flags planted on foreign soil. But the latter half of the 20th century birthed a totally different breed of domination. This new empire didn't require a single bullet. It was built by men in tailored suits, crossing the globe with briefcases stuffed full of lending contracts. This invisible, bloodless conquest hit Latin America harder than anywhere else on Earth. Here, the International Monetary Fund didn't just issue lines of credit, it effectively took over entire nations, rewriting their laws, dictating their budgets, and altering the fate of hundreds of millions of people. And it was all sold to the public as necessary economic stability, when in reality, it was about protecting the people at the very top. The irony here is incredibly dark. When the IMF was born in 1944 out of the wreckage of World War II, it was pitched as the financial guardian angel of the free world. Its core mission was to step in when economies stumbled, stabilize currencies, and help shattered nations rebuild. It was supposed to be a global paramedic, arriving on the scene to save the patient. But down in Latin America, that paramedic quickly ripped off its mask to reveal a ruthless debt collector. Its new goal, guaranteeing that the megabanks in London and Wall Street got every single penny back, regardless of how much the patient had to bleed. To understand how this financial cartel gained so much power, we have to rewind to the mid-20th century. Nations like Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil were desperate to modernize. They wanted to leap into the future, and to do that, they shielded their local industries, subsidized daily essentials like fuel, and expanded government payrolls to keep the working class happy. Politicians promised an economic utopia today, but they bought it using a credit card that would come due tomorrow, and that bill was going to be catastrophic. By the 1970s, the global financial system was swimming in cheap cash. As oil prices skyrocketed, Western banks were flooded with profits, and they were itching to lend that money out. Latin American politicians saw a golden ticket. They borrowed astronomical sums of dollars to construct massive highways, fund public programs, and keep their political careers thriving. On the surface, it looked like sheer genius. Economies boomed, and the leaders were hailed as heroes. But the illusion shattered in the early 1980s. To fight off crippling domestic inflation, the U.S. Federal Reserve cranked interest rates into the stratosphere. In the blink of an eye, Latin America's cheap, manageable loans turned into financial suffocations. The cost to service that debt tripled and quadrupled. Suddenly, the money ran out. In 1982, Mexico had to step up to the global microphone and confess a terrifying truth: they were broke and couldn't pay their creditors. It was the equivalent of a sovereign nation filing for bankruptcy. And right on cue, the IMF stepped out of the shadows. To get the bailout money needed to survive, these sovereign nations had to surrender the steering wheel. Governments were forced to slash the subsidies that kept their people fed. They had to intentionally crash the value of their own money, freeze the wages of their workers, and sell off public utilities to private bidders. National budgets were no longer debated by elected officials in Buenos Aires or Mexico City. They were engineered by bureaucrats sitting in air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C. Every single one of these new, forced budgets had a singular goal: make absolutely certain the foreign banks did not lose a dime. For the local politicians, the IMF became the perfect scapegoat. They could push through these devastating cuts and tell their furious citizens, "Our hands are tied, the IMF is making us do this." It gave cowards political cover, while everyday people paid the price. The cost of basic survival soared. Mass layoffs gutted the working class. Hospitals and schools were left to rot. Latin America was turned into a brutal testing facility for extreme austerity, and the citizens were treated as totally expendable. The devastation that followed is hard to overstate. Economists coldly refer to the 1980s as Latin America's lost decade. While these countries funneled billions of dollars out of their borders to service foreign debt, their own populations were plunged into severe poverty. Economic growth didn't just stall, it violently reversed. It was the equivalent of holding a drowning man underwater and demanding he empty his pockets. This wasn't just a statistical decline. It looked like violent riots tearing through Caracas when gas prices were jacked up. It looked like chaos in the streets of Argentina as inflation ate people's life savings alive. It was rampant starvation, mass unemployment, and the toppling of governments. In some cases, military dictators used this IMF-enforced austerity as an excuse to violently crush their own people. Throughout all of this horror, the IMF maintained the public image of a neutral, mathematical referee, but the math was entirely rigged to ensure that power and capital flowed in only one direction: up. When Mexico collapsed in 1982, it was just the first domino. Dozens of countries had fallen into the exact same debt trap. The massive banks in New York, Frankfurt, and London suddenly realized they were staring down the barrel of a global financial wipeout. The IMF didn't intervene to save Latin America. It intervened to bail out the global banking system on the backs of Latin American citizens. This aggressive strategy became the infamous standard for the region. It demanded open markets, brutal spending cuts, and the fire sale of state-owned enterprises. On paper, it was supposed to create lean, efficient economies. In reality, it obliterated the middle class and transferred public wealth directly into the hands of private, usually foreign, investors. Take Bolivia in the mid-1980s. The country was drowning in hyperinflation, with prices doubling almost daily. The IMF prescribed a radical shock therapy. They instantly ripped away subsidies and gutted public spending. Yes, the inflation eventually stopped, but the cure almost killed the patient. Unemployment went vertical, industries vanished, and entire cities were hollowed out. Bolivia's spreadsheet looked balanced to the bankers, but the actual human beings living there paid for it with absolute despair. Argentina is perhaps the most tragic example of how this financial medicine acts as a slow-acting poison. For over a decade, Argentina played by all the IMF's rules. They sold off public assets and tied their currency directly to the US dollar. For a brief moment, it looked like a triumph. Foreign money poured in, and leaders boasted about being the IMF's star pupil. But beneath the surface, the rot was spreading. The country couldn't export its goods, the debt continued to mount, and the working class was getting crushed. By 2001, the entire illusion violently imploded. The government froze bank accounts, trapping the life savings of millions of people. Buenos Aires erupted into absolute chaos, with citizens storming the streets demanding the heads of the political elite. The IMF, which had paraded Argentina around as a success story, quietly backed away while the country burned. From Peru to Brazil, the cycle was terrifyingly repetitive. The creditors were always stabilized, and the citizens were always left to stagnate. And through it all, local leaders happily played the game. They loved the short-term popularity of borrowing and spending, knowing full well that when the bill came due, they could just point the finger at the IMF. It was the ultimate shell game of avoiding responsibility. During the lost decade, average incomes collapsed, poverty exploded, and essential investments in the future were completely abandoned. Instead of catching up to the industrialized world, Latin America was thrown into a dark age. Entire generations were robbed of their futures just to ensure that Wall Street balance sheets remained intact. It is vital to recognize the true nature of this game. The IMF was never an impartial judge. It was controlled by the United States and Europe, the exact same powers whose banks held the debt. Sovereign independence wasn't conquered by military force. It was erased by financial leverage. But the most terrifying aspect of this history is that Latin America was merely the prototype. The brutal tactics of privatization and austerity perfected in the 1980s were later unleashed on Asia in 1997, Russia shortly after, and eventually Greece in 2008. The tragedy of Latin America was weaponized into a global standard operating procedure. Was the suffering of all these people just a side effect of bad math, Or was it the intentional price paid to maintain a global order where creditors always win? This dark chapter of history is unsettling because it isn't safely in the past. It is a blaring siren for the present day. The exact same toxic brew of massive borrowing and deferred consequences is currently boiling over in the wealthiest nations on Earth. The lesson is undeniable. When your debt grows too large, your independence is put on the auction block. When the math inevitably breaks down, someone else gets to decide your fate. Just look at Greece after the 2008 crash. When they couldn't pay their debts, the international financial authorities stepped in with the exact same playbook used in the 1980s. They demanded ruthless austerity, gutted pensions, and forced the sale of public assets. Greek politicians stood at the podiums and echoed the same tired lie: we have no choice. The outcome was identical: misery for the masses and security for the lenders. Today, global superpowers like Japan, Italy, and the United States are carrying debt loads that would make a 1970s politician's blood run cold. The only difference right now is that the market still believes these massive economies can foot the bill, but market confidence can vanish in a single afternoon. If inflation persists, if growth dies, and if the creditors demand their pound of flesh, the trap will snap shut. The policies forced onto Latin America will become the new reality for the developed world. The ultimate truth is that debt is not just a number on a ledger, it is a collar around your neck. Leaders use it to buy popularity today while selling off your tomorrow. The global financial system uses that debt as leverage to dictate the rules of the game. And as rich nations pile on historically unprecedented debt, that trap is closing fast. They might not use the word austerity. They'll dress it up with terms like fiscal discipline or shared sacrifice. But the reality will be exactly the same. Budgets will be slashed to protect the banks, while everyday people take the hit. This is exactly why the lost decade must be burned into our collective memory. It showed us the naked truth of how the global financial machine operates. Latin America was treated as a disposable testing ground, and millions of lives were derailed in the process. But once you see the strings, you don't have to be a puppet. You might not be able to vote on IMF policy, but you have total control over what you consider to be real wealth. The institutions your grandparents trusted have failed. The markets your parents relied on have crashed. The lesson here is brutal but liberating. Do not trust your future to systems you cannot control. True wealth is found in tangible assets that hold their value, skills that cannot be outsourced, and networks that cannot be repossessed. History rarely repeats itself perfectly, but it rhymes with a terrifying consistency. The shadow empire of debt wasn't just a 20th century phenomenon. It was a preview of what happens when the preservation of the system becomes more important than the survival of the people. If we ignore this lesson, the same brutal playbook will be deployed again, only this time it will be in the heart of the Western world. So the next time a leader tells you it's time to tighten our belts, remember who is actually going hungry. Remember that debt is just leverage, and leverage always has a master. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The past left a trail. I'll show you where it leads.
Forget everything you've been told about 2008. It wasn't a glitch in the system. It wasn't an unpredictable financial hurricane. It was the most brazen, well-orchestrated wealth transfer in modern history, built on a foundation of unhinged greed, blind regulators, and toxic debt packaged as pure gold. When the house of cards finally gave way, it completely wiped out Main Street. It stole retirements, dismantled careers, and shattered families. But the ultimate tragedy? The architects of the disaster didn't go to prison, they went to the bank. If you were a regular citizen working a 9-to-5, you were blindsided. You woke up one morning to news of a booming housing market, and by dinner, century-old banks were evaporating into thin air. Wall Street was begging for life support, and your government happily opened the vault, handing billions of your taxpayer dollars not to the families losing their homes, but to the exact executives who burned the economy to the ground. The media loves to bury the truth of 2008 under a mountain of complicated garbage, derivatives, CDOs, tranche ratings. But if you cut through the noise, it's a tale as old as time. Unaccountable elites playing God with other people's money. Let's go back to the early 2000s. The dot-com bubble had just exploded, and Wall Street needed a new casino. They found it in the American housing market. Home ownership has always been the ultimate dream, but the banks weaponized it. They created something called a mortgage-backed security. The concept was deceptively brilliant. Take thousands of individual home loans, mash them together into one giant financial meatloaf, and sell slices of it to global investors. They sold it as a guaranteed money printer, a risk-free yield backed by American real estate. But the machine was hungry, and it demanded constant feeding. When the banks ran out of qualified buyers, they simply lowered the bar until it was resting on the floor. Enter the subprime era: zero down payments, no income checks, adjustable rates, with explosive hidden fees. They were handing out mortgages to anyone with a pulse, knowing full well these people would default. Why? Because the banks weren't holding on to the loans. They were immediately selling that toxic debt to someone else. Behind the scenes, the greed mutated. Wall Street invented credit default swaps. Think of them as side bets in a rigged casino. Investors were buying insurance policies against these terrible mortgages. They were literally placing billions of dollars in wagers that the American homeowner would fail. And the watchdogs, the rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's, they were being paid by the very banks they were supposed to be auditing. They took absolute financial garbage and slapped their highest AAA stamp of approval on it. By 2005, the warning lights were flashing red. The market was completely detached from reality. People were buying their fourth investment property on credit while working minimum wage jobs. It was an illusion of wealth. Then the interest rates reset. The monthly payments skyrocketed. The defaults cascaded. Suddenly those bulletproof mortgage bonds were exposed for what they were: completely worthless. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, a titan of global finance, vanished overnight. Bear Stearns was wiped out. AIG was brought to its knees. Global credit froze solid. And the fallout was apocalyptic. Trillions of dollars of working-class wealth vanished into the ether. But here is where the story gets incredibly dark. The government intervention wasn't designed to rescue the middle class. It was designed to rescue the cartel. Politicians rushed to inject trillions of dollars into the banking sector to save the economy. But the economy they saved wasn't yours. While millions of ordinary citizens were thrown to the wolves, the executives who engineered the collapse used the bailout money to pay themselves massive retention bonuses. It proved once and for all: profits are privatized, but losses are socialized. The system doesn't serve you, it manages you. Fast forward to today, and the exact same machinery is operating, only the stakes are astronomically higher. To fix the 2008 crash, central banks used quantitative easing. They magically printed trillions of dollars out of thin air and flooded the markets. If you held hard assets, stocks, real estate, you got incredibly rich. If you relied on a paycheck, you got crushed by the hidden tax of inflation. Then 2020 hit, and they doubled down. Governments printed more money in 24 months than they had in the previous 10 years. They handed out stimulus checks to keep the masses quiet, while transferring historic levels of wealth to the top 1%. And now the bill is due. Record-breaking inflation, spiking interest rates, unprecedented sovereign debt. The cracks in the foundation are showing again, but this time the bubble is everything. So how do you survive the next collapse? Number 1, beware of complexity. Wall Street uses jargon to make you feel stupid so they can pick your pocket. If a financial product requires a PhD to understand, it's a scam. Number 2, follow the incentives. If the government will always bail out the reckless will always gamble with your money. Number 3, true wealth is financial education. The system relies on your financial illiteracy. You don't need a Wall Street pedigree, but you must understand the difference between an asset that puts money in your pocket and a liability that drains it. You have to recognize when the market is euphoric, and you have to know how to calculate real, intrinsic value when everyone else is blindly speculating. The crash of 2008 wasn't the finale. It was a dress rehearsal. The architecture of the next crisis is already fully constructed. When it breaks, don't look to the politicians or the bankers for a life raft. Expect volatility, expect money printing, and expect a bailout for the elite. Your only defense is knowledge. You must build your own resilience before the storm hits, because history does not forgive those who refuse to learn its lessons. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The past left a trail. I'll show you where it leads.
The most earth-shattering financial secrets aren't locked away in modern Wall Street servers or the marble halls of ancient Rome. They are buried in forgotten vaults, masked by wartime conspiracies, and drenched in the blood of empires. At the top of that list is a legend so massive it threatens to rewrite modern economic history: Yamashita's gold. As the Japanese war machine crumbled at the close of World War II, whispers began circulating about a staggering hoard of plundered wealth. We are talking about mountains of gold bullion, priceless religious artifacts, and raw diamonds stripped from conquered nations across Asia. If the rumors are true, this hidden reserve eclipses anything ever stockpiled by the Spanish Empire or Nazi Germany. But where did it all go? Is it a genuine historical cover-up, or just an economic myth engineered to hide a completely different kind of war? A war fought not with artillery, but with off-the-books ledgers and absolute financial power. To grasp the sheer scale of this phantom wealth, we have to rewind to the 1930s and 40s. By 1942, the Japanese Empire had swallowed up massive territories across the Pacific. And with conquest came plunder. Temples, national banks, and private family fortunes were ruthlessly stripped bare. This wasn't random battlefield looting. It was a highly calculated, industrial-scale extraction machine known as Operation Golden Lily. Allegedly overseen by the imperial family itself, including the brother of the emperor, Golden Lily drained the wealth of entire nations. But as the tide of World War II turned, the logistics of moving thousands of tons of gold back to mainland Japan became impossible. So the strategy shifted: bury the loot close to the front lines, primarily in the Philippines. If the empire fell, these hidden reserves would serve as the ultimate insurance policy for a future comeback. Enter General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the infamous Tiger of Malaya. Tasked with holding the Philippines against advancing American forces in 1944, Yamashita also supposedly became the ultimate guardian of these unimaginable riches. According to the legend, subterranean labyrinths across the islands were packed with gold bricks and looted antiquities. And to ensure absolute silence, the prisoners and laborers who dug these vaults were tragically sealed inside them, a ruthless, permanent end to any witnesses. Yamashita surrendered in 1945 and took his secrets to the grave, later executed for war crimes. But the gold didn't just vanish. For decades, the Philippines became ground zero for the ultimate treasure hunt. In the 1970s, a Filipino man named Rogelio Roxas claimed to have breached one of these vaults, unearthing solid gold bars and a spectacular golden Buddha stuffed with raw diamonds. His reward: he was arrested, beaten, and thrown in a cell by the regime of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos himself is widely suspected of financing his billions by quietly excavating Yamashita's caches, enriching his inner circle, while his citizens suffered under crushing national debt. But the rabbit hole goes much deeper than corrupt dictators. Declassified documents and whistleblower accounts point the finger at American intelligence. Elite operatives allegedly discovered these vaults shortly after World War II. Instead of returning the stolen wealth to its rightful owners, these billions were purportedly funneled into the Black Eagle Trust, a sprawling, off-the-books financial leviathan used by intelligence agencies to bankroll anti-communist operations throughout the Cold War. If this is true, Yamashita's gold didn't just disappear. It secretly financed the geopolitical architecture of the entire 20th century, completely hidden from the public eye. This is where a tale of buried wartime plunder crashes head-on into our modern financial reality. In the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods system crowned the US dollar as the undisputed king of global finance. But beneath the pristine public ledgers, an entirely separate, shadow economy was operating. It forces us to confront a chilling reality about the money in our pockets today. Why do governments always seem to have endless secret reserves? Why do the elites always have access to hidden liquidity, while the working class is crushed by inflation, taxation, and engineered economic crises? Superpowers claim to hold thousands of tons of gold in fortresses like the New York Federal Reserve or Fort Knox. Yet independent, third-party audits are virtually non-existent. We are simply commanded to trust the system. But history screams at us that trust is a fool's game. Central banks now conjure trillions of fiat dollars out of thin air. During recent financial meltdowns, we watched governments deploy bailouts, quantitative easing, and shadowy liquidity facilities. These are the modern equivalents of hidden treasure vaults, engineered not to save the working citizen, but to insulate the ruling class from the consequences of their own recklessness. The myth or reality of Yamashita's gold proves that massive wealth is rarely destroyed. It is merely transferred, concealed, and weaponized. The elites will always build parallel financial systems to preserve their power, leaving everyday citizens completely in the dark. Achieving true financial sovereignty means waking up, getting educated, and refusing to blindly trust the institutions built to farm your labor. History doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes. Whether the wealth is locked inside a golden Buddha, a subterranean military vault, or a central bank's digital ledger, the ultimate question remains: who really controls the treasure and who is being left to pay the bill? If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The past left a trail. I'll show you where it leads.
Imagine going to bed knowing your life savings could buy a home and waking up to find it won't even buy a cup of coffee. Your hard-earned paycheck is garbage the second it touches your hands. People aren't keeping cash in wallets anymore. They're shoveling it into wheelbarrows. This isn't a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. This is hyperinflation. And it has happened more times than we dare to admit. We treat money like bedrock, a permanent foundation. But history screams a different truth. The worst hyperinflations didn't just zero out bank accounts. They broke governments, shredded families, and incinerated empires. They ripped through societies like a financial wildfire, exposing just how breathtakingly fragile our modern world really is. Today, we are going to look at 5 nations that watched their currencies turn to ash and the devastating human toll it left behind. And remember, the fire of inflation never starts with an explosion. It starts with a spark. It whispers, and by the time the smoke alarms go off, it's already too late. We begin in the ashes of World War I. Germany was suffocating under the Treaty of Versailles, condemned to pay over 132 billion gold marks in reparations. It was an impossible, crushing mountain of debt. So what did the government do? They reached for the deadliest, easiest weapon they had, the money printer. At first, it felt like a relief. Then prices doubled. Then they violently exploded. By late 1923, the German mark had fallen into an abyss. A single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Citizens were literally burning stacks of cash in their fireplaces just to survive the winter. Children stacked bricks of worthless currency in the streets like toys. Lifetimes of middle-class sweat and savings were erased in a matter of weeks. But the truest casualty wasn't the money, it was faith. When a society loses trust in its currency, the social fabric tears. That financial ruin bred a deep, bitter desperation. It became the dark, fertile soil that allowed political monsters to rise just a decade later. Fast forward to Zimbabwe at the dawn of the 21st century. Under President Robert Mugabe, catastrophic land seizures violently dismantled the country's agricultural heart. Facing international isolation and a collapsing economy, the regime responded the only way desperate governments do. They turned the printers on overdrive. The death spiral was staggering. By 2008, inflation hit an unimaginable 79.6 billion%. Prices were doubling every single day. The government desperately tried to paper over the bleeding, printing 10 million, 100 billion, and finally $100 trillion bills. It was a tragic joke. Eventually, the currency died entirely, replaced by foreign cash. But the human cost was permanent. Pensions were vaporized. Industries were gutted. An entire generation was forced into economic exile. The only people left standing were those who held physical, hard assets. Now we look at the absolute worst hyperinflation ever caught on record, Hungary, immediately after World War II. The nation's infrastructure was a graveyard. To fund reconstruction and pay wartime debts, the government flooded the streets with a currency called the pengo. They printed with such reckless abandon that prices doubled roughly every 15 hours. The inflation rate hit 41.9 quadrillion%. That is a 4 followed by 16 zeros. The math itself broke down. The government issued a mil pengo, a million pengo, then a b pengo, a billion pengo, chasing a runaway train they had no hope of catching. Eventually, the currency was entirely scrapped. What was lost? Everything. The Hungarian middle class was annihilated. Hyperinflation didn't just reset their economy, it permanently erased their past. If you think this is ancient history, look at Venezuela. Sitting on an absolute ocean of oil, it should be one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Instead, it is politically rotten. Years of massive corruption, rigid price controls, and lethal fiscal mismanagement triggered a slow-motion car crash. To cover its bleeding deficits and cling to power, the regime fired up the printers. By 2018, inflation breached 1 million%. Imagine being handed your paycheck and sprinting to the market because by tomorrow, half its value will be gone. Grocery shelves were stripped bare. We saw highly educated doctors and engineers fleeing the country just to deliver food on bicycles in neighboring nations. The government tried a pathetic magic trick, slashing 6 zeros off the currency overnight to hide the damage. But you cannot legislate away economic gravity. Millions became refugees, and the economy was gutted from the inside out. Finally, we arrive at the bloody collapse of Yugoslavia. As the country violently tore itself apart in the 1990s, the economy was crushed by war, brutal sanctions, and total mismanagement. By 1993, inflation crested at 313 million% per month. To survive, everyday people abandoned the dinar, relying on smuggled US dollars and German marks in the shadows. The official government money became a national punchline, worth more as kindling or wallpaper than as actual currency. A dying regime, printing dying money while the society fractured underneath them. You hear these stories and you think, well, that's history, that's other countries, we are smarter now. Are we? Look at the world today. Global debt is staggering. The United States alone is dragging around over $34 trillion in debt, and the clock is spinning faster every second. For an entire decade, the world's central banks treated money like an infinite resource, printing trillions out of thin air to prop up markets, suppress interest rates, and keep the grand illusion alive. For a while, they got away with it. But then the fever broke. In 2021 and 2022, the bill came due. Supply chains snapped, wars broke out, and all that printed money finally hit the streets. Inflation roared out of its cage. The central banks went from arrogant printing to sheer panic, hiking rates and shaking the markets. And who paid the price? The everyday citizen. Rent skyrocketed. Groceries became a luxury. We are not in hyperinflation today, but the terrifying psychological warning signs are flashing red. The exact same dangerous, arrogant assumptions that burned Weimar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela to the ground are alive